Hello, everybody. Welcome to our podcast, NGO Soul and Strategy. And I'm excited to talk with one of my fellow consultants today, Dave Algoso. I've been observing him and admiring his writing on strategy in the social sector for a couple of years. And I've been keen to have a conversation with Dave about the real in-use practices around strategy in our social sector. So welcome, Dave.
Hi, Tosca. Great to be here.
Yeah, let's get going here. So a little bit about Dave. He is independent consultant at Open CoLab. That is his own consulting practice. He was the managing director of Reboot, which is a social impact consulting firm. And I've noticed from a distance that you work with social impact actors as well, which is, to me, is really interesting. You were a program manager at MercyCorps at one point in your career as well. And you started out your career working domestically at the US state level, in particular in organizing and advocacy. So I have so many questions. So here we go. There are, of course, tons of writing about how to formulate strategy and how to implement it. They come from the private sector often. So my first question to you, Dave, is in what ways is strategic planning in the, let me just call it the social sector, whether it's domestic, US or international, in what ways is the strategic planning just the same in the social sector? And in what ways is it different?
Thanks, Tosca. Great to be here. And that's such a great queuing up question. I think, as you say, there is so much that's written about strategy and strategic planning for the private sector, and we tend to bring a lot of that into the social sector. Yeah. And I, to be honest, to be upfront, I'm a bit of a skeptic of that practice of bringing things in from the private sector, not because there aren't things that we can learn, but because I think that private sector actors, consultancies especially, have an incentive to oversell the relevance of their frameworks and of their practices beyond the kinds of organizations that they have built those practices with. So I think we want to make sure we learn, but I think there should be learning both ways. We should learn from the private sector as well as from sports teams and universities and churches and like every other organization that sets a strategy. That means there's a lot of great frameworks that we can learn from, but there are, in my mind, two big differences. One is just the core aspect of the values and the mission that social sector organizations have. Whatever your specific mission is, whether you're a social service organization or you're doing advocacy and change or your national development, wherever you are, your mission should ideally transcend the kind of business interests and the profit motive and all these other things. For a private sector organization, no matter what they talk about, that is always the primary constraint that they are under, and it's always the primary driver. It's not to say that we don't have business models or care about those aspects in the social sectors as well. But the centrality of values and mission has to be part of the process. It has to be something that you're thinking about and that you embed throughout it. Right. And then the other big difference in our sector, obviously, is the split for many organizations between where the money comes from and where the money goes. In most private sector organizations, you have a clear feedback loop with customers. That means that the customer, the user, however you want to think about it, is your primary audience that you're trying to serve. We in the social sector have often at least two audiences, unless you're a cooperative or some organization that's funded from its members. Typically, you have donor funding, grant funding, government funding coming from one side, and some community or set of organizations or constituencies that you're working with on the other side. And bridging that gap is always going to be a challenge. So we have to be aware of that, be cognizant of it, try to approach it in ways that kind of increase the equity and justice in the system, as opposed to serving the donors, which is the big risk and the big pitfall that many organizations get drawn towards. So those are kind of the two dynamics that I see as the biggest differences in the social sectors.
Makes sense. And I'm just gonna, a process point, I'm gonna remind both of us, myself included, that we may want to talk a little slower because we have a very global audience, and I want to make sure that that they can can fully take in all the wisdoms that you are sharing. I love what you said about we need to ask that question, not just what can the social sector organizations learn from the private sector, but also vice versa. Along with that are you familiar? I'm not. with how the public sector, how public government sector organizations do strategy? And is there relevant content there or approaches that you happen to have seen?
Yeah, first I want to thank you for the generosity of saying that the talking too fast comment was about both of us. It's a problem I have, and I will be more cognizant of it as we go forward.
It's quite all right.
I don't work with public sector organizations as much. Some of the organizations I've worked with have been funded by USAID or others. So there's sometimes some component to that. What I've observed and talked to people who work more in that space is that they are under a very different political dynamics. It's almost, you have then sort of even more sets of stakeholders you have to please. If you're at an agency like USAID, it's Congress. Or the administrator, or possibly the administration in the White House. They have to be much more cautious about the things that they say, and because there are, if Congress is your primary constituency and funder, you then have not just one organization, but there are all the people in Congress who are potentially going to make hay out of anything you do. So they have to be a lot more careful about what they share publicly, about how they frame what they do, and that obviously constrains what they're able to do as well.
Got it. Yes, I'm glad I asked that question. Now, the reason, Dave, why I wanted to invite you to the show was that I wanted to ask you, in the last year and a half with the pandemic, and you've written about this, including on Medium, and we'll put those that article as well as your SSIR, Stanford Social Innovation Review article. We'll put those in the show notes. But how has strategic planning changed during the pandemic, right? There was a lot of attention in the beginning on scenario planning, etc. But tell me what you, as a practitioner and as a consultant, somebody who both guides and facilitates and accompanies, what did you see that changed about the art of strategic planning?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first things we saw, obviously, was this operational shift that everyone had to go through. When March and April hit last year, we all went virtual with everything, and we can talk about the long-term impacts of that. And there's going to be eventually, especially in places with vaccine access and uptake, a shift back to more hybrid, some mix of virtual and in-person. And I think we've learned, though, that we don't need to travel as much as we need, as much as we thought we needed to. Yeah. That operational shift then influence the way that we do processes like strategic planning or other processes, because we realize that we can actually spread them out in a different way. If previously we would have done a 2-day retreat where we got all the team together and we were trying to use that focused time, we would have had to rush from session to session with breaks and trying to kind of manage our energy and focus between. But you would have finished your morning session on understanding the context, let's say, and gone right into your afternoon session on what this means for our work. Because you had everyone together and you didn't want to have to travel back home and then travel back together again. If you're coming together virtually anyway, that gives you the space to actually do that session and then wait a week or 2 weeks before coming back to the next session. Yeah. It lets the ideas stew a little bit. It lets the ideas kind of simmer in the background so that you can do some more reflection, have some external conversations. It lets you thoughtfully break up the process a bit more, rather than feeling like the logistics of travel mean you should do the whole thing in one little sprint. And a couple of the organizations I've worked with have done this very effectively by giving themselves the time in between, maybe to have working groups work a bit asynchronously, separately, rather than having to jump right into that next conversation. So that's sort of from the process and operational standpoint. The other big side, obviously, is what the events of the last year have done to how people are thinking about the context and what they're trying to achieve. And there I would point to the pandemic and being a huge one. If you work anywhere in any form of healthcare, obviously that's going to be a concern for you. But then also if you are thinking about the economic effects of it, this has been the biggest recession since the great financial crisis 10, 11 years ago. I think the pandemic has put a spotlight on the haves and have nots, or I would rather say the gets and doesn't gets in our world, in a way that I think little since maybe the Occupy movement circa 2011 has. So many more organizations are paying attention to that. And then obviously just a year ago, the murder of George Floyd in the United States brought new attention and new participation in the movement for Black lives at a level that I don't think we've seen since maybe the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014. Just so that movement has also taken off and spread far beyond police violence, to get organizations thinking about equity and inclusion in their work, to get international organizations thinking about decolonization and what that means. So there's been a whole host of issues that have been pushed to the forefront for organizations in this moment to really grapple with and think about what that means for their work.
So I want to probe a little bit more on the level in between the operational that you sketched and that the big shifts in context, and that is on the how-to of strategic planning. So I remember also from your writing, can you say something about instinctive moves that your clients or others that you were able to observe made in the beginning of the pandemic that you say were probably not the right ones, given the rapidly changing environment and with so much uncertainty? What did you see there, and what did you try to help?
Yeah. There was obviously that moment at the beginning where no one knew where things were going. And I had a post I wrote early on about peak uncertainty.
Yes.
It wasn't peak pandemic. That didn't hit, I guess I'd have to look at the numbers. I don't know exactly when the worst of COVID was. Obviously it still continues in many places.
Yes.
And I'm very privileged. I'm here in New York. We have great vaccine access and uptake. So people are thinking about getting back to quote unquote normal, and we can talk about all the problems with that. But I think that early on, there was a sense of like, we've got to plan what comes next. And I, in that post and in some other conversations with people, tried to say, don't try to plan too far out. We were like March, April, May, even a year ago, we were in this moment where we didn't know what the path was going to be. We didn't know really how long some of the economic lockdowns or the social distancing requirements or masks were going to take. There was a lot of speculation about how quickly vaccines were going to come, and then what the access was going to be like to them after that. If you were an organization that was previously doing in-person events, for example, how far back did you push things? Yeah. And I remember I had some retreats that were supposed to be in April and early May last year that originally we were saying, okay, well, we can do it in the summer. And then it was like, okay, we can do it in person in the fall. And then we finally realized that's not realistic at all. No. I don't think anyone made any big commitments based on those choices, but I think in that moment of what felt like complete chaos, organizations were better off narrowing down what they were focusing on and focusing on things in the near to midterm. And by midterm, I meant maybe 4 to 5 months out, not a year out.
Right.
And trying to make sure that they're continuing to stay true to their mission and their strategy through that, knowing that that period of peak uncertainty was going to resolve a bit. And I think over the next several months, certainly by the summer, we had a better sense of the trajectory of things, of just how bad it was. Testing was ramping up, PPE was ramping up, the ability to get personal protective equipment for frontline healthcare workers was ramping up. So we started to sort of see where the pathway was going to be. We started to understand how bad was the winter going to be, for example, in the Northern Hemisphere. There are still those challenges in a lot of places, but we, I think, have a better sense of the trajectory. And so we can extend our planning horizon. We can extend how far out we're looking with some fidelity, with some accuracy in a way that we weren't able to early on.
Yeah. Okay, let me go a little bit into I strongly believe that organizations, including in the social sector, are also jungles, meaning where politics and power are played. And again, I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but just it is, right? So organizational level self-survival instincts are incredibly strong. Team and unit and budget impetus to try to survive in a strategic planning process, especially given not just the pandemic's enormous economic downturn aspects and the enormous uncertainty, and for some organizations, very real financial threats. But we're coming already as an international social sector of at least 5 to 8 years of plateauing of certain funding streams and sources, etc., and downward trajectories. So in your role as a person who accompanies and guides strategic planning processes, How do you take account of these instincts to try to, as hard as possible, protect my budget, my team, my program that I care about, or just the very organization, even if there is a reason to not to do that?
Mhm. I think first I start with that same premise that you have, which is this is natural. There's nothing wrong with it. People care about the work they're doing. They care about the work their team is doing and their organization is doing, and they feel a responsibility to protect it. They feel a responsibility to that mission. It's why they are leaders in their organizations. It's why they've been able to raise the money to do this work. So I don't try to imagine that that's going to go away. I don't try to imagine we can navigate around it. I think as an outsider to an organization, it's important to try and understand those dynamics as much as I can. It's one of the reasons I love often working with the same organizations over and over again. Somebody I did a strategy with, I come back a few years later, things have evolved, their team has changed, but I understand the basic dynamics in a way that that can be hard to get up to speed when you're coming in for the first time. When I am coming in for the first time, or when I'm coming back to an organization I haven't worked with in a while, I think trying to understand those dynamics from almost an ethnographic perspective. I learned this from my former colleague and friend Panthea Lee, who was one of the founders of Reboot, where I worked, to bring that kind of design research perspective to understanding the tensions that exist and the interests, so that you can help organizations navigate it. And then from there, once you understand that, and you and whoever's kind of convening that process understand it, create spaces for people to see it themselves, and to then try and identify the larger we behind things. So to be able to lift their heads up, not ignore those interests or ignore those things that they're trying to advance, but to be able to see what's the broader mission that ties us together. And if there's not one, then that's a different issue and that's a different problem you need to tackle. But I find in most organizations that are semi well functioning, there is some broader identity or mission behind it that you can tap into and help people to make some of those trade-offs and see where things need to go and how we together navigate that. But I do remember, I remember a conversation early on I had with somebody who worked at a funder who was making some hard choices about where they were allocating their funding in this moment. And I asked what was meant to be just a provocative question, which is, do you at some point look at your portfolio and say, if we are going to constrain our funding, and actually a lot of foundations didn't have to constrain their funding that much because so much of their endowments are connected to the stock market. And so their endowments were actually, they dipped quite a bit, but then they recovered quite well.
Oh, yes.
But many of them were at the same time thinking about shifts towards whether it's work around healthcare or greater work around inequality, or realizing this is the moment to finally do some work around just economy. And then obviously wanting to commit more to racial justice issues. Yeah. So I think there were some foundations that were not necessarily constraining their funding overall, but were making some shifts. And I asked what I thought was a provocative question, which was, do you at some point look at your portfolio and say, not all of these organizations are going to survive this moment? And be cold-hearted a bit to say, there are some that the sector that we're supporting needs. There are some that are doing especially good work. And there are some whose funding maybe should taper off. And we should help them with that transition and be honest about that and help those talented people find someplace else to work.
Yes.
And I've never worked at a funder. I don't know how I would actually deal with that were I in that position. But I actually, maybe it was just this person I was speaking to didn't feel like completely open, showing their cards with me. But I felt like they weren't really grappling with that potential challenge and what it means and what that responsibility is if you are the one who is making choices about where the money goes, to not make some deliberate choices there. Yeah. I don't know. It's a hard question for individual organizations, for teams, and for the sector or sectors, however you defined it, as a whole.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing that is well known is, although not always acknowledged, is that for quite a few organizations, putting together a strategy is what I would call a symbolic artifact, meaning it's something that looks good in the office on a shelf. It primarily communicates to those stakeholders that we care about that we are a professional organization, and I'm putting my fingers in air quotes now, but do not have the real intent to actually use it, right? How do you, as an external support person, as consultant, try to guard against that?
Yeah. I mean, this is the shiny PDF problem. Is we create it, it gets designed, it goes in someplace on your website, and then within a year, it's irrelevant to anyone. This ties a little bit to the dynamic that I mentioned earlier on of having multiple audiences that you're dealing with. There are expectations from a board or for funders that a strategy look a certain way. Whereas the core users of a strategy, in the sense of people, not who use the document, but people who the strategy needs to be relevant to, who they should be able to look to it for guidance and for helping them make decisions, is the team and any kind of core partners and stakeholders who want to understand what they can expect from your organization. For that set of users, the shiny PDF might be nice and inspiring, and it might be lovely to point to it, but the content matters a lot more. And it can be so easy, if you're thinking about that board or funder audience, to shift the way you're framing it, to water it down even, to have some kind of different framing on everything that you put into it in a way that it no longer helps people make real decisions. I've been lucky enough that because I write about this problem, many of my clients are the people who come to me who do not want that shiny PDF version, or they want to do the minimal version of that to satisfy these stakeholders while focusing on the thing that's going to give the team real guidance. That means the team has to kind of live and understand and breathe the strategy through the process. They've got to be involved in crafting it in order to understand how it got to where it is and what it means when we say X instead of Y. That's a nuance that can never be conveyed in that PDF, but by being part of the conversation, they'll have a better grasp of it.
So is it, if I may interject, is it your experience that if the team, as you say, it has breathed the process, has been involved from the beginning, you write about it in your SSIR article, that's not a guarantee, though, that it's actually going to be used for decision making, right? That it's actually actionable.
It's not a guarantee, but it cues you up to make it a reference point. So artifact, okay. I don't want to put down the idea that an artifact is a useful thing. It's got to be the right kind of artifact, though. So if the report or the document that comes out at the end ties to conversations you've had, it will help them better, the team, and I include partners in that, better implement it because they understand it. But it also then becomes a reference point at your annual review, quarterly meetings, however you decide to kind of revisit this set of decisions, to say, we all know why we made this choice. Like, because we realized this was a major problem we weren't dealing with, and we needed a new program that did X. And so we moved in this direction, and here we are. And it worked or it didn't work. And now we can adjust from there. So it should never be a static thing. But because the team was part of that process, because they experienced it, right? It's all about people having an experience of it that embeds it in their understanding of what their work should be and of what the organization is. It doesn't mean, I'm not someone who thinks we needs to be kind of 100% participatory of every decision needs to be complete 100% perfect consensus. We're never realistically going to get that there in most organizations. But I think people need to be brought along with the process and involved in the right ways at certain points, so that when it gets to the end, they understand why those choices were made.
Okay, I wanna go a little deeper yet on. So in the private sector, strategy literature, one of the many things that is emphasized is that there has to be quite a strong discipline once a strategy has been formulated, to have it, what some people say, cascade down to the business unit or the regional unit, whatever, and all the way down to the individual. I don't know about you, but I know quite a few organizations where I don't see that amount of discipline in having that cascade down to the organization, nor do I see necessarily an effect to do something which I've seen done really well in some NGOs, namely to paint a picture that goes together with the strategy, namely, this is how our organization will be different 3, 5, whatever years from now. This is how it will look different. It will be populated by these people with these competencies. It will work primarily with these stakeholders. We will try to shift our culture in this way and really visualize that picture so that people know we're going to move from here to here. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, I think I feel like I hear two things in that question. The cascading down is about how are we embedding the strategy in the organization. And I like to use the term incorporating. So incorporating in the sense of incorporate, like I guess the Latin root of the word or whatever, is to make into a body, to make whole. I think about incorporating a strategy into an organization in the sense of you make the organization the strategy. You make the organization the embodiment of it. And you do that both by the big changes that you make, so aligning the budget with a strategy, thinking about what cultural shifts you want to do with a strategy, but also making sure that the strategy reflects realistically what the organization is now. There's a balance between the path dependency of what you are as an organization now and where you want to go. And you want to start with where you are and figure out where you want to go and how to get from here to there.
Can I just stop you for a moment, Dave, just to explain to our audience, when you use the word path dependency, not everybody knows what that means. What
that's fair. I mean, the history and the context of the organization and how you got to where you are. So it means that you have this certain set of departments or programming, these relationships with funders. You might put a stake in the ground and say, we want to go to there. We want to be that kind of organization in 3 to 5 years. But here's where we are now. And how are we going to get from here to there? Is it being opportunistic and seizing the new programming as it comes? Is it being deliberate and cutting out things right now so that we can make room for new growth? What are those choices that we're going to make? Some of those, for sensitivity reasons, you might not be as explicit about, but the people who are going to be involved with those choices should understand them. But I want to come back to the cascading question, because to me, so much of it is about, it's not about gathering information so that some strategists or some executive team can set a strategy and then you cascade it out. It's about sort of bubbling up and cascading down. It has to be iterative. It has to start with the organization as it is and what it's seeing in the world and what it's learning about its work. And that's why having people throughout the team and throughout the partners, other organizations you work with, having them involved, so that those ideas come into the middle of the conversation, not the top, but the middle, and then go back out to the edges again as those choices are made about how we're going to evolve our work, whether it's embedding new practices or policies into our work, whether it's new lines of work. But it's got to be iterative so those things align, and it has to be iterative over time as well. So you kind of bring things into the center and you make those choices and you incorporate them back into the organization. And then you reflect on that as time goes on, whether it's 6 months or a year later. How have the choices we made that try to put this strategy into practice, how have they become a reality? Are we seeing the signals that we are moving in that direction, or have we failed to do these things that we said we were going to do? And if so, like, why? Was it some external thing? Was it us not focusing enough? How do we change that now? And I'm seeing this with a strategy refresh. I'm leading with a team right now whose strategy I helped to write 2 years ago. They're doing sort of a refresh process. And as we're looking at some of the shifts they want to make in their work, we're realizing that some of these were things that they wrote 2 years ago. And so we have to reflect and say, why did we not live up to that choice? And what are we going to do differently this time? And be honest with ourselves about that. And to make those choices going forward.
Yes. Oh gosh, I would like to ask you at least a couple more operational questions, but we don't have time for that. Dave, when do you not want to get involved as a strategy consultant? What are the warning signs?
I mean, I'll start with one or two things that aren't warning signs. An internal mess is not necessarily a warning sign. If things are confused, if things are difficult, that's not necessarily a warning sign. I love working with amazing teams that want to get to that next level, but there are also a lot of great organizations that are feeling a little bit stressed, a little bit muddled in what they're trying to do, because the world is changing, and they are struggling to keep up for one reason or another. But sometimes these are organizations that if you get them on track, they can do some amazing work. I also find that people don't actually often have a good sense of how much of a mess their organization is. People who tell me that things are pretty straightforward, I later realize that things are actually kind of messy internally, and people who think that they're a total mess just have a different expectation for their own organization. That might be a good thing. If their expectation was really high, you can help them to reach it. I would say the places where I am going to be more hesitant to engage, the places where I feel like I don't understand the organization or the work it's trying to do well enough. I work with a range of different organizations who are, I work with open government organizations and anti-corruption organizations and peace building organizations and various others. But if an organization came in that was focused on healthcare, or an organization came in that was focused on education, unless there's some connection to an area of work that I do have some knowledge of, As a consultant, as a facilitator, I'm never the issue or the area expert, but I have to at least be fluent enough to understand the challenges you're facing. So I would tend to say, like, this doesn't sound like a good fit for me. I think someone else is better. The other place where I'm potentially going to step away is I've had some struggles with large bureaucracies, sort of UN-sized bureaucracies, where they attract some amazingly talented people who then spend a lot of their time banging their heads against the bureaucracy trying to get it to move. And if you can get that bureaucracy to move an inch, you can get dramatic effects out of it because it's this machinery. But I know it's incredibly frustrating for those internally, and it's not necessarily a role that I find I'm good at or am fulfilled by to help them move that little bureaucracy when it's a 10,000 person agency.
Got it.
So
got it. Yes. Pivoting a little bit. What do you think, since you're such a strategy specialist, what's the latest and greatest innovation in ways of going about strategic planning? Are there any that you think are really standing out at the moment?
I've been very excited to see more organizations embrace the learning aspects of the work, both the learning aspects of strategy processes, but then also integrating learning into their work, thinking about how do you build a learning culture? How do you build learning practices? How do you shift from kind of a counting version of monitoring and evaluation, where you're just trying to track your work and its outputs, which is often for accountability to the outside? How do you shift from that to approaches that actually inform your choices, to inform the decisions that strategic decisions you're making as a team, and then also inform other partners' choices, other people in the field, to reflect some learning back to them. A lot of organizations are thinking, if we want to do better work as a whole sector, as a field, whatever field or subsector you might be in, we need to all be learning how to do better work. And that has to be a core part of our strategy. I don't think that was really well understood or widely understood 15 or 20 years ago, when people were really starting to embed monitoring and evaluation practices. It was more for that accountability side and not for the learning and adaptation side. So I'm seeing that come in. I'm seeing this, people understanding that strategy cycles should be shorter, and that means less investment in making that big shiny PDF and more frequent investment in iterating on that strategy as you go. Depending on where your funding source is or what kind of constraints that puts you under, that can be hard. So you
think that's a good thing, shorter Absolutely. Strategy?
Absolutely. I wouldn't go so far as like agile development kind of teams of, this is again a place where we can learn from the private sector and the technology sector without thinking that we need to become them and have a scrum team in every different organization or whatever it might be. Like, there are ways to learn the principles of being more iterative without going too far. Yeah,
makes sense. And at the same time, Dave, what classics on strategic planning do you still fall back upon, and something that I could put in the show notes, for instance?
Sure. So I'm a sucker for a good 2x2 matrix. I will put anything into a 2x2 matrix, mostly because I think it is the perfect level of complexity. Like, you can get 2 dimensions, you can get 4 options, you can clarify what you're trying to think about, but not at too abstracted of a level. I tend to, there's a phrase, there's an American comedian, you probably know, Stephen Colbert, who spent a decade playing this particular right-wing buffoon. And when he went to do a Tonight Show where he was sort of being himself, everyone asked, how are you going to do it? How are you going to make that switch? And he quoted a principle from improv comedy, which is to wear your character as lightly as a hat, meaning you can take it off. I think of the same way with strategy frameworks. I wear my framework as lightly as a hat. If it's not serving me anymore, I want to take it off. If that 2x2 isn't helpful, let's get rid of it. Let's try a 3x3. Let's try a simple spectrum diagram. Let's create frameworks like, the classic SWOT is like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. If that's not working for us, let's just do strengths and weaknesses. Like, let's iterate on these things and not feel locked into any of them, because they were all created by someone at some point. So we should feel licensed to reappropriate them and recreate them for whatever purposes we need in that moment.
Okay, that gives me a lot of thought. All right, we are almost at the end, so I'm going to ask you a random question. It's not a question, actually. I'm going to say something, a random sentence, and ask you to just kind of disclose a little bit more about yourself in it. So don't make it too much about the world. Make it also about yourself, please, in announcing.
I feel nervous about this. I don't know what this is going to be.
Oh, no, don't. the world can never have enough of ...
Collaboration.
Collaboration. Okay.
There are
last
good
one.
kinds and bad kinds of collaboration, but I think in general, we need more of it, more deliberate. It becomes kind of a fluff word that we use in press releases, or we talk about.
Totally.
It's wonderful. It's one of our values. I think deliberately thinking about what does it mean to work together within organizations, across organizations, to be structured about that. And there's very much an equity side to this as well. Are we making sure that everyone is included and everyone has space to bring them their full selves? Whether that's accommodating people who have caregiving responsibilities to make sure that they're able to be pushing back against professional norms that are favor old white men in order to make sure that everyone is able to bring their full talents and energies to the work. To me, that's a core part of collaboration, is how are we designing those spaces so that people are included and that we can bring their best ideas and energy, because we have so many problems in the world. We need everyone to be able to do their best, and we need to be able to work together to do that.
To bring their best and to bring their whole person. Yeah. So Dave, where should people go if they want to learn about you and your practice?
So I have a website for my practice, which is Open CoLab, open-colab.org. But you can also find me on Twitter, a little bit too much on Twitter sometimes, on LinkedIn, and I've got a blog on Medium. So there aren't that many Dave Algosos out there. If you Google me, you'll find me.
You do, and I am familiar with all of those, so we will put those in the show notes without any issue. So thank you, Dave, for all the insights and learning that I got from this. And I know I would love to delve deeper, and we'll do that at another time again. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode helpful and stimulating, then please check out, we have other episodes on NGOs and strategy in the series. You can find this podcast at fiveoaksconsulting.org, also on my new YouTube channel. Also in our book, the co-author book on the future of transnational NGOs, between relevance and between power and irrelevance, I should say. We have a chapter on strategy, although that is actually looking at strategy more at a meta level for the whole sector and how the sector has evolved in terms of what it wants to see as its role. So all of those you can find more out on our website, fiveoaksconsulting.org. This is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO, Soul, and Strategy next time.